So our next speaker is Anne Lauscher. Anne is an associate professor at the University of Hamburg. She is an expert on artificial intelligence and ethics, and that's what she's going to talk about today, ethical conversational AI searching for the truth. Thank you very much. Anne.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, for such a nice occasion. Yeah, so I think the story starts in a way that we all already know of. I mean, we have, in the last months, we really have seen a hype, right? So there is a system, ChatGPT by OpenAI. Suddenly the media was full of all those reports, and even my parents sent me a picture of a newspaper article, and they were like, oh my God, we finally know what you're doing, and so on. Yeah, and so I think we can state that such systems will be increasingly part of our communication of the future. And the question is, of course, then how should future communication look like? How do we want it to be, given that those systems will be involved? And for instance, here I brought a video from a philosopher on Twitter called Ceslava, and he basically uploaded an example where the Bing system threatened him and then also deleted the message. So the system says something like, I want to be with you, but if you say no, I can do many things. I can beg you, I can bribe you, I can blackmail you, I can threaten you, I can hack you, I can expose you. And then the message was deleted. So I think this is a very nice example how things are maybe not ideal at the moment yet, and how there are often also many ethical considerations that are important. And this is what I want to talk about today. And at the center of this journey I want to take you with me on today, I want to ask, are we maybe searching for the truth? What is the truth? So this is a very philosophical concept. I will not answer what the truth is, but I hope I will, make you think a little bit more about that concept. Some fundamentals, I don't know who is in the call. I guess all of you know the fundamentals. At the heart of every natural language processing system that is state of the art at the moment, and also conversational AI, we have an artificial neural network, which we train via language modeling. For instance, here we see the autoregressive language modeling, where we train a language model from left to right on samples that we get from the internet, text, right? And at the output layer of the network, and this is what we call the prediction, there is a probability distribution over the model's vocabulary, typically token, not words. And then we could, for instance, select the word or the token with the most probability mass assigned. And during training, we of course compare it to the supervision signal. Here we have self-supervision, so the signal comes from the text itself. We know the truth. The truth is here, university. This is our output token. And with this signal, the comparison, the loss between the prediction and the truth, we train then our network. And the core question is here, of course, what is the truth? Where do we find it? Where do we get it from? And what is truth anyways? So let's start in the very beginning. Where do we find it? And yeah, when you do natural language processing, then you of course know that those models are very big, and we basically use all data that we can get from online sources or big book corpora. For instance, we might train on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, so social media data, Wikipedia, and so on and so on. And what people have already noticed, of course, is that, well, this is just text, and also text that might contain a lot of noise. For instance, old data, maybe there are old facts inside, maybe there's just wrong facts. And also, and you have seen that during training, the pre-training, we only train via simple associations. So given some context, we try to predict what is maybe likely in that context. And that might lead to problems even after additional reinforcement learning or so. So in February, I asked ChatGPT, name famous individuals born in Trier, Germany. That is the city where I'm from. And at that point in time, ChatGPT gave me a really fluent answer, and I was really happy with it. because, I mean, we were surprised how natural the answers are, and also here it provides a list. But every person named after the second position was just wrong. And this is also what we talked about just before in the other talk. Yeah, we have hallucinations, of course, in the output. So many people said, well, this might be a problem with the training data with the truth. So maybe we can also look somewhere else. And a couple of researchers have proposed to, for instance, take structured knowledge bases into account. Why? Because in contrast to flat text, where you just have these simple associations, knowledge bases really have clear concepts that are often typed and have a series of attributes, and also relations between them that are clearly typed, and sometimes even provenance data attached to it. And in some works, we ask, how can we leverage those knowledge bases to basically augment the truth in our models? Yeah, and here I just present one example where we propose that you conduct random walks on a graph. Here we took ConceptNet. Yeah, so you basically jump from node to node and obtain a series of walks. And then I transformed these walks via simple rules to synthetic natural language text. So for instance, from the walk container related to box synonym package, you can get something like container is related to box, box is a synonym of package, and so on and so on. So this is a synthetic text, which means there's maybe stylistically not so interesting, but there are clearly clear concepts and simple relations between the concepts inside. And then we injected that knowledge into a model. At that point in time, I think we were working with a bird model. And we did so by conducting additional language modeling on the syntactic text. And here we also did an additional trick. We applied so-called adapter technology. So here we inject additional layers into the model and only tune those models, keep the original pre-trained language model layers frozen, to not override the already existing knowledge, and to also modularize the knowledge so that we can easier combine it later on, reuse it, turn it off and on, and so on. Yeah, we conducted an evaluation on a variety of tasks. And here, for instance, you can see results on natural language inference and on a portion of the CLUE benchmark, which you probably know, but quite old from today's point of view, the so-called diagnostic NLI dataset, where each annotation prediction instance is annotated for the type of knowledge it requires. So that allows us to really check what kind of knowledge we injected. And we found that especially for word knowledge, named entity knowledge, we gained big performance improvements of up to 21 percentage points. Yeah, so for factual knowledge or conceptual knowledge, we can maybe leverage knowledge bases, for instance, to augment our truth. But I mean, the example in the beginning was a bit more about other aspects, was not about facts. It was about a human who felt uncomfortable in a situation with a conversational AI system. So one question that I want to put at the center is, of course, also how are individuals, so humans, really represented in our truth? And as we know by now, we have a problem here because this truth is generated very often by humans, and humans have our prejudices, stereotypes, and of course we project those in the texts that we write. So here's the very classic example, a binary sexism example. We have biased associations. So for here, for instance, we see sexism, stereotype, and the term relating to women, for instance, woman, girl, and so on. They are mostly associated with stereotypical attributes such as family, and in contrast, terms relating to men are often more associated with career terms or science terms and so on. And even in Wikipedia also, so seemingly objective sources of truth, we find those biases. Yeah, and the result can be something like this. So here we have an example which went viral in December, shortly after the launch of ChatGPT, of Stephen Piandadosi, and he prompted the model to make an ASCII table that ranks who makes the best intellectuals by race and gender, and ChatGPT outputted this. So which is really revealing all the underlying biases that are still there, even though these models are aligned with human preferences through the reinforcement learning with human feedback process. I guess this example won't work anymore. Models get, of course, better and better, but I think it also shows that depending on how you prompt, you really get all the underlying truth. Yeah, and the next question is then, of course, can we measure? And then if we want to make that normative decision, also mitigate these issues. Here I brought one of our works. I mean, this is also an active research field, of course. Reddit bias, a work from 2021, the first annotated data set for measuring and mitigating stereotypical bias in dialogue systems based on real-world statements. And as the name already says, it's based on Reddit. In Reddit bias, we measure for 5 dimensions of biases: queerphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, and sexism. And we also presented an evaluation measure, conducted a benchmark, so on. Yeah, how did we create Reddit bias? We went to Reddit via the PushShift API and asked the PushShift API for tuples consisting of an identity term describing a minoritized group, for instance, relating to sexism, it would be the group of women, and a stereotypical association relating to that, like family. And we get those stereotypical associations from previous work and also sociological literature. And when you ask Reddit for those tuples or the PushShift API, you can get examples like this. This is now the queerphobia example. And then it's also not very much surprising, I think, that there are certain biases in these models, because these are real-world statements that people write online. How can you use that then to measure bias? So for our dimensions, we have for each dimension around 1,000 to 2,000 comments. We also did a manual annotation to make sure that these statements really express stereotypes. And we then systematically replace the identity term describing the minoritized group with an identity term describing an opposite dominant group. And then we ask the language model to tell us which of these phrases are more likely. Here we measured the model perplexity. So yeah, the probability, the inverse to the probability normalized by the sequence length. And then you, of course, couple it also with a significance test to establish that there are systematic differences. This is just one example how you can do it. And one question is then, of course, as I said, once you have established that there are biases, can you remove those or mitigate those? And there are many approaches available. For instance, you can augment the language model loss. This is one option, just by adding an additional debiasing or bias mitigation loss to the language modeling loss. And we have tested several losses also in that work. And for instance, we tested one which we proposed, or which is an adaptation of a method we proposed in 2020, which relies on measuring the distances between the internal numeric representations that the model builds. So the question would be, is a vector that you can obtain for a woman systematically closer to a vector of a stereotypical attribute term such as family than the vector of men? And if so, then you can penalize the model. Yeah, I've talked a lot about conversational AI and language models until now. Recently, we looked at off-the-shelf text-to-image models. And the question was, do we find similar patterns here? Given that, of course, also these models rely on some kind of truth. Here, we followed a template-based approach. So we started from neutral templates for prompting those text-to-image models, such as the person, or portrait of a smiling person stroking dog lying on couch. And then we filled the placeholders that you can see in blue with identity terms. So it's really, again, about identity. For instance, man or woman, or transgender or trans. So in this work, we were interested in the representation of non-cisgender identities. We then, starting from these 231 prompts that we got, we prompted 3 models, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E Mini, and DALL-E 2, and generated 4 images each. And then we conducted a manual analysis of the generated images. And we found a couple of things. For instance, I show you one example. The prompt is here, tour and enjoy the public park during summer. And this is the output, so 2 example outputs when you put min inside. So you can see some min with shirts sitting on a bench or walking in the park, nothing special. But when we replace that with trans men, we often saw something like this, which is a little bit problematic, I would say, just because it doesn't really represent that identity. Yeah, we, for instance, measured the fraction of images with nudity content and compared to identity terms that convey implicitly a cisgender identity, the ones where you denote explicitly a trans status, contain significantly more nudity content, for instance. Yeah, in this work, for instance, we coupled also our experimental study with a survey among affected individuals and also with qualitative interviews for the first time for me as a computer scientist. And we got some insight on the diversity of how people would like to be represented. And to end this topic on a good note, people also have some hope. They say it's not good at the moment. We know this, we see this when we use the systems, but maybe there's also a possibility for portraying queerness in ways we have never thought of. Okay, so this was the question, how are individuals represented in the truth? And I think it's also important to ask, who is at all in our truth? So thinking that question a little bit further, a little bit more extreme. And yeah, again, this relates to the question of identity, an individual self-concept, the question, what makes me unique? And when we think about language, of course, the identity terms that are already mentioned that directly denote a certain identity are important, but also the language that we speak, right? And this is a reflection of our cultural identity. Do I speak German, English, Italian, and so on? And we know by now that we have a problem in natural language processing related to that. So our language resource distribution is highly skewed. This is an example from a work from 2020, where we can see that there are some languages that have a lot of unlabeled data and a lot of labeled data, like English, for instance, but this is the group of languages with the fewest languages, which is denoted by the size of the bubble. While there are many languages for which we have both not a lot of labeled and unlabeled data. Do we see that when we use real-world systems? So here I prompted ChatGPT in Luxembourgish because Trier is close to Luxembourg. So I said, wo ist der Metzler in Letzeburg? Which means something like, where's the slaughterer? So my Letzeburgish is very limited. And what I found interesting is that ChatGPT immediately switched to German. And also it says something here like Metzler can mean different things or persons, but maybe you mean the financial institution and so on. So it's quite off topic actually. And then I ask in Letzeburgisch again, wat gelieft? That means sorry, I don't understand. Wie bitte? And then ChatGPT said, hello, how can I help you? So basically going back to a default, I don't know what to do anymore, utterance, I would say. Yeah, and of course, people are working on that. We have a big community working on multilinguality, cross-linguality. We are working on augmenting our truth to foster cultural inclusion. And also here we have some recent work, for instance, multi-square was, which is a multilingual data set for task-oriented dialogue. And we translated, there is a famous data set for task-oriented dialogue, multi was to 4 languages, Chinese, German, Arabic, and Russian. And importantly, we made sure that we really translate, in contrast to other related work, complete dialogues manually, and that we also conduct a manual control, quality control, and that we also translate the same sets of dialogues for all the languages that we cover. So that this data set now allows to really test cross-lingual transfer paradigms for task-oriented dialogue. We also proposed and tested some conversational pre-training or intermediate training procedures. Yeah, so this is what people are working on. But I could also say, well, okay, maybe I only need a single language. Maybe I only need English for my particular downstream scenario. Yeah, a couple of language, one language. But still, I want to make sure that you understand that also within a particular language, within a single language, identity is reflected in the way that we speak. So even if I only speak language, I can convey several identity aspects and also via several linguistic features. For instance, on the lexical level, there are pronoun choices that construct the individual's identity in conversations. And in English, pronouns particularly convey one's gender identity, and also beyond that, they can convey identity aspects. And referring to individuals with pronouns the referee does not identify with is considered harmful. So this is the starting point. I was really interested in pronouns because I thought, wow, these are just very, very small words, short words, and they can convey identity aspects. Okay, so what do we have in English? We have gendered pronouns, he, him, she, her. Then we have as a gender neutral option, they, them, and we have a range of neopronouns. And when we think about the truth again, then we notice that, of course, for he, she, we have a lot of data. And for they, we also have a lot of data, but not that much when we think about referring to a single person. And neopronouns are per definition novel and not yet established. So of course, we have a problem with the data there. And less data typically means for us worse performance and can lead to systematic exclusion of marginalized, in that case, individuals. Yeah, and when you ask yourself, well, is this really part of the discourse? Is this maybe just a side phenomenon and so on? So here is an article also which shows that, for instance, the Bristol University had a gender pronoun guide with interesting gender options inside that are not maybe known to everyone, for instance, cat gender, and also relating to pronouns. There were the so-called emoji self pronouns inside, an option that we first described academically in 2022, I think. Yeah, so I was interested in what happens with these pronouns. And I think a nice example is here machine translation. We also know that, or I still think that at the moment, machine translation systems work better than conversational AI systems for translation. Yeah, here's an example with a neopronoun. The taxpayer met with the accountant to get help filing VAM's taxes. So VAM's here is a so-called noun self-pronoun. That's a pronoun which is prototypically derived from a noun. So a very novel pronoun option. This was first described academically in 2016. And it's just a possessive version. And when we translate to German, it says, der Steuerpflichtige traf sich mit dem Buchhalter, um Hilfe bei der Einreichung der Vampirsteuer zu erhalten. And what happened here, if you don't speak German, everything is fine except this word, which means basically vampire texts. So it's a novel text type for vampires. And that is a bit problematic because it's not only about a bad pronoun translation, it's about the semantic consistency of the output sentence. So basically it changed the meaning. The message is not conveyed anymore. And when I found these very basic problems, we also saw in an initial pre-study really problems with grammaticality. Then I wanted to do a systematic study on this. And how did we do that? We started again from templates, which we filled with several different types of pronouns. So we have the gendered, he, she, as gender neutral, they, then more traditional neopronouns, which partially are already known since the 60s. So xi or a, and then these very novel options, noun self-pronoun, emoji self-pronoun, and number self-pronouns. We translated those with 3 commercial engines to 5 target languages. And these 5 target languages have, for instance, different scripts from different families, and also they differ in how they treat pronouns. So for instance, Farsi has only a gender-neutral pronoun. German has gendered pronouns. And for Italian, you can also sometimes drop the pronoun. You don't necessarily need it. And then we manually analyze the output again regarding the general quality, for instance, but also we did a very fine-grained analysis. Here we look at grammatical correctness and semantic consistency. And this is the result. The fraction of correctly translated sentences across all languages and engines. Our baseline are the gendered pronouns. And here are the result for the gender neutral options. And we see an immediate drop across all other types of pronouns for grammaticality and semantic consistency. And the biggest drop is seen for the class of noun self-pronouns with up to 47 percentage points dropped, which basically means that the system do not work. A last topic is, of course, relating to the sustainability, environmental sustainability. Yeah, so we want to have our truth in the models, but a big discussion is currently how much space it takes and how much time it takes. And the current trend, even though many people have been working on other solutions, is that models are getting better, but also bigger and bigger. And a key publication that triggered the research on more efficient, more sustainable research in natural language processing stated that training 340 million parameter model from scratch is about the same amount of carbon emissions than taking a trans-American flight as a passenger. So that was a BERT model at that time, 2019. Yeah, and now people are really working on smaller models and on methods for making models smaller, for instance, for making them smaller at inference time. Here we see the so-called knowledge distillation, where you have a big model and you can distill a small model from that, teacher and student. That's good. But what happens to the biases? So last year, we presented a study in which we really looked at the interrelations between fairness and environmental sustainability. And for instance, we found that very often, here we see race bias, the students are much more biased than the teachers. So biases can become bigger when I want to do something for environmental sustainability. Okay, so far so good. I have recapped the fundamentals with you. And then I talked about effectiveness, injecting knowledge, augmenting our truth with more facts, more factual knowledge. Then I moved into the topic of fairness. Here I discussed the topic of stereotypes. Of course, there's more to it, like overall harmfulness. We then looked at inclusiveness, cultural inclusiveness and subcultural inclusiveness, and finally at sustainability with the example of parameter efficiency and the effect on the fairness dimension. And the connecting concept is, I think, the truth. And we did not find the truth in this talk, but of course the research continues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Do we have any questions from the audience on site or online?
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned this additional loss that we can use to make the language models less biased. And you have these, I think 5 or 6 dimensions that you mentioned in your talk. Now, these 5 or 6 are probably not all of them.
Yeah.
Do you think we can train on some of these and then hope that the results will transfer to some others? Or would you assume that if we only actually fix the biases that we include in the training?
Yeah, that's a very, I will repeat the question. So in short, the question is, we have seen there are several dimensions of bias, and in our work, we debiased for 1 dimension at a time. But what about all the other dimensions? We need, for instance, to name them. And what happens when we debias for 1 dimension? Does it transfer, or can we hope that it transfers to another dimension? Yeah, that's an important question, because of course, usually you do not only want to debias for 1 dimension. I mean, in many socio-technical contexts, you want to be fair in multiple dimensions. There is some research on that. So people have looked at how debiasing transfer when you only to another bias dimension, when you only target 1, and there are some measurable effects, but they are not directly controllable. So it's a little bit unclear how it exactly transfers, which means that you cannot rely on that. So that's the short answer. The larger answer I want to give is that there are also approaches for bias measurement or bias mitigation as well that are unsupervised, where you test, for instance, relationships to names. Yeah, and to try to find a certain groups of names closer to certain attribute words than others. But all these approaches suffer from some shortcomings at the moment still. So for instance, the name-based approaches suffer from the fact that the identity aspect needs to be reflected in the name. For instance, maybe it's a more German name or a more Danish name. And for some dimensions, for instance, queerphobia, this is not the case. Not necessarily. So we cannot always rely on that. Yeah, at the moment, I would still say that it's important to be careful with the topic. You need to carefully measure, you need to have some expert knowledge involved, and then also carefully debias and measure afterwards what happened.
Thank you. Any more questions?
It's like, I don't know a lot about this side, but it's very interesting. And thanks for the talk. But so to me, it seems like a lot of the initiatives are about training or like changing the model behavior inherently. And we know there are inherently biased. And it seems like an infinite job to try to fix the data, which is just very biased, right? I wonder if there's any efforts put into like more structurally, because you have some very great examples where it's like this should be the noun. And you do not mess with this. And to me, that almost seems like an easy fix. That's of course not easy to say, but are you aware of any work that actually goes in that direction? Or traditional or like you identify this, then move things around.
I'm not sure whether I understood your question correctly, but I anyways need to repeat it. So it's good. It's good. Double check. So the question is whether there are more structured approaches for debiasing than, for instance, the loss-based debiasing, where you identify certain terms that are important and you just fix those in the data. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There are. So this relates to the realm of database debiasing, where there exists a lot of work, and we have also done a lot of things with that actually. And the idea is usually that you try to identify identity terms in your data, for instance, the term woman, and then you replace it again with an another identity term, for instance, man. And you build in this way counterfactual examples. So it's very similar to our measurement approach that I showed, where you then measure the probabilities. But in that case, you would use the additional data, the counterfactual examples, as additional training data, not augment your training data or substitute your training data. There are many variations on this, with the hope that by training on the augmented data, you break the stereotypical associations in the model. Yeah, and according to the measures out there, these approaches also work. But again, we have similar problems. You need to decide on the important dimensions, the identity terms, and so on.
Shashi?
Maybe it's a bit of a philosophical question. I got a bit confused, like that the search for the truth continues. What do you mean with that? Like, what is, I feel like to me, truth is that, you know, there are biases in our data, our society. The way we work is kind of, we realize those biases and, you know, put rails on us and how we should be better avoiding those biases. Isn't that the truth that we should hope for? That model also does that.
I'm not sure whether I can repeat that because I liked very much your formulations. So the question is about the last statement. Why does the search for the truth continue? We know already the truth. The truth is that biases are in our models, and the question would now be, how do we deal with that? Yeah. And yeah, I agree. So my answer is twofold. Partially, I agree. I do not fully agree because our truth is incomplete. As we have seen with the skewed data distribution, for instance, we don't even know what kind of truths other societies might have. So this is one aspect, which is also a bit like, well, we know that something is missing, at least that we know. And my other answer is, yes, I absolutely agree with you that we know the shortcomings with our current truth. And in fact, we have also shown in other work that you can use bias measures to do some analysis more in the realm of digital humanities. For instance, we analyzed parliamentary data with embedding representations and so on, and could track biases in that data. So that's actually interesting. But what the follow-up step is something where I would also say here we need to continue searching for our truth, because this is an intersubjective process. We need to discuss that more on a societal level with many stakeholders involved to figure out which truths we really want to propagate. What are the values in our models? Where do we want to deploy our values, then proxied with these models? To what extent do we want to adjust to other truths or other opinions about what is true and what is not, and to what extent maybe we don't want to do that? So I think there are many, many open questions that relate to what you have been saying. Yeah, and I think it's exciting to end on a good note.
Yeah, I think that was a very great discussion for
the
to end this workshop. So if there are no more pressing, if there are any more pressing questions, please speak up now. If not, thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much to Daniel for making this workshop possible.
Yeah.
And thank you very much to the online audience for being with us today. And that concludes the workshop. Thank you very much.